Okay, this is Biology, Unit 7, Segment 1, Mendel, Genetics, and Inheritance, one of my favorite topics. So we had Gregor Mendel. This is a name that you are going to need to be familiar with. Sassy Gregor. Right up here is an image of him. He spent much of his life, many years of his adulthood, studying and watching the behavior of pea plants. He would grow them and cross-pollinate them and record all of the details about the physical appearance of these plants. And anyway, in doing so, he really discovered inheritance. He discovered the process of characteristics being passed from one generation to the next. Heredity. Genetics is defined as the study of this heredity. And heredity, you guys, think of how you may look like your parents. You might have characteristics that resemble your parents. Puppies will look like their parents or have some characteristics that will resemble their parents. Corn seeds grown will look just like the parental corn that they were taken from. Okay, so that is heredity. That's what we're talking about here. Very basic terms. We have trait is a specific characteristic. We talked about this in the last unit. Traits, I have a few examples listed here. Tall, short, hair color, eye color, fur color if we're talking about animals, seed coat texture if we're talking about plants, and color. For humans, here's a few traits, cleft in the chin, widow's peak, dimples, brown or black or blonde hair, freckles, brown eyes or blue eyes, free earlobes or attached earlobes at the base, and those are all traits. And we'll draw attention to these traits within the unit. Okay, so trait is really a general characteristic. Now gene we learned last unit is a section of DNA that codes for a particular trait. Okay, there's a section that will code through transcription and then ultimately translation for height or for seed coat texture. So a gene is a segment of DNA that will determine that trait that we just mentioned. Now allele. You haven't seen this word before. So genes, which code for a particular trait, can come in different forms. So for example, we have blue eyes and we have brown eyes. That would be called an allele for a gene. So the different forms of a gene, like blue eyes versus brown eyes, is going to be called an allele. Okay, so the two the different forms for height, like tall versus short, those are going to be considered alleles. Okay, so the form of a gene. And here is this image showing, here's your cell. Inside the nucleus, we have all of your DNA wrapped up in chromosomes. So here they are as chromosomes. Uncoil the chromosomes, and we end up with segments of DNA here, and this chunk, this small chunk right here, happens to be a gene, and it will code for a particular trait. That part's review for you. Gamete is a review as well. Gamete is the sex cell. Okay, so for the males, in plants we have pollen. Okay, and in animals we have sperm. With females we have egg or ovum. Here's a picture of a human egg and a sperm. There. Now we also learned about mitosis and meiosis. Meiosis is the process that forms the sex cells. So I want to go back and remind you a little bit about a couple of the main phases here. So we have with metaphase 1 of meiosis, remember, the chromosomes line up with their partner. Okay? And one of these is from mom, one of these is from dad. So there's two different alleles for all of the genes that are coded for in these two particular homologous chromosomes. And we have another set here. So we have 23 pairs total. This is only showing 2 sets of pairs. Now once these split, line up with the second metaphase and split off, now we end up with our gametes, guys, the individual eggs and the individual sperms. Now when we're talking about what is coded on these chromosomes, we're talking about the genes and the alleles, and we're going to talk about using letters to represent a particular type of gene, which is called an allele. So the allele could be a capital T or a lowercase t. That would be the allele. So a parent that has a capital T and a lowercase t, remember you have two forms of an allele because you have two chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. So if your dad gave you a big T and your mom gave you a little t, your alleles are going to be big T, little t. Now, if for you and your sex cells that you make, you can make big T gametes or you can make little t gametes. Okay? You're going to make both, actually, because you have both available. Somebody that's a big T will only make big T gametes. Remember? Gametes cut those in half, so you can't have big T, little t gametes. You just have a big T gamete or a little t gamete. You can't have both. But the law of segregation is one that we merely mentioned earlier, but it's a separation of alleles during the gamete formation of meiosis. The fact that these will separate out right here in that first metaphase 1. They will spread out and form two new, or go to the edges of the cell, and then they will line up themselves individually and then split in half at the centromere. But the fact that this happens right here with meiosis is really the law of segregation. You have your chromosomes lining up with their homologous pairs. Every sperm or egg gets one randomly assigned copy of the gene, whatever you carry in your 46 chromosomes. And then crossing over, I want to remind you about that happening because that is actually something that occurs that allows for variation. So if you have your homologous chromosomes lining up in metaphase 1, the legs can actually cross over, break off, and reattach. We talked about translocation as a mutation that happens. This is an example of that. But so you have variation. So instead of a full green chromosome being pulled away and a full yellow chromosome being pulled away, now you have a little bit of yellow on the green, which means that it shakes it up a little bit in your genetics and what you're carrying. The law of independent assortment is another law that you need to know about, and this is the fact that each trait is inherited very much separately. Okay, so when the gametes are made, these legs, the chromatids, separate at the centromere and split off and go into individual eggs or sperm. So what that means is that we're going to consider that each trait is inherited separately. So, for example, blonde and blue eyes, you're not going to be blonde and blue eyes always. Whatever chance you're going to be blonde is completely separated from whatever chance you're going to be blue-eyed, right? You're not going to be blonde and blue-eyed guaranteed, right? It just depends on how these two separate individual traits are going to be inherited. Okay, dominant versus recessive. This set of notes is really a ton of vocab, this segment, and more than any other. So this is primarily vocab, and then we're going to be actually applying the vocab in later segments. So dominant alleles, remember an allele is a form of a gene. So a dominant allele is always expressed with a capital letter. Okay, free earlobe, 6 fingers, which is called polydactyly, widow's peak, round seed coat. These are all dominant traits, and we represent them when we write them down as a capital letter. Recessive alleles are expressed only when they're paired with another recessive. Remember, you have 2 alleles for every trait pretty much. One from mom, one from dad. But if you have 2 capitals, you're just going to show dominant no matter what. But if you have 1 capital and 1 recessive, that dominant will actually mask the recessive allele, and you'll only show the dominant trait. The only way you can show a recessive trait is to have 2 recessive alleles. It's represented with a lowercase. Genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism, so you're going to see it written as letters. When you see this, it's your genotype when you write it in. So you're showing the alleles that the person has. That's your genotype. And we call capital T homozygous dominant. Homo means same, so homozygous dominant means they're the same, the 2 are the same and they're both dominant. Hetero means different. Heterozygous means they have 2 different alleles, capital and lowercase. And then homozygous recessive, homo means same, recessive means lowercase, so they're going to be 2 lowercases. They're always going to be 2. One from mom, one from dad. You're always going to have 2 alleles for a particular trait. So that the letters represent your genotype. You cannot see a genotype. It's actually in the genes. So this is your letters, what we're considering. All right, homozygous means a pair of identical alleles for a trait. We talked about that already. So here are a couple examples of homozygous. Homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. And we're going to using these words, so you're going to have to get really good and savvy and quick with the vocab. Heterozygous means one is dominant and one is recessive for the trait. So you will have a big T and a little t. Okay, big G, little g. So if I say homozygous dominant, you will automatically know to write down 2 capital letters. If I say heterozygous for a trait, you know to write a capital letter and a lowercase letter. And the capital letter, by the way, is usually the letter that starts the dominant trait. So if you're talking about has a widow's peak, you would use W, because having a widow's peak is dominant over not having one. And so you would use the letter W. Okay? So for example, tall versus short, you're going to use T for the letter. That's just a rule of thumb. Phenotype is your physical appearance. So this is not the letters. This is actually what you look like. This is what you're going to see. So the fact that someone is tall, okay, that's what we call a phenotype, your physical characteristics. Hybrid, there's a couple more vocab words. Hybrid is going to be offspring of parents that have different traits. So if a parent is homozygous dominant, one parent is, and they cross with a homozygous recessive parent, so this might, we're talking about plants, so there's no male, female necessarily, although there can be, but one parent is this, the other parent is this, they're going to only produce these. And we're going to actually talk in the next segment about how that's possible. But we have a name for this. When this happens, it's called hybrids. These 2 plants have made a hybrid. True breeding are organisms that will produce offspring that are identical to the parents if they're allowed to, in a plant situation, self-pollinate. So if a short pea plant self-pollinates with itself, it's only going to have nothing but short. And so that's a true breeding situation. They're homozygous. Homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive, regardless, but they're homozygous. Okay? And that is it.